Good morning, everyone. I will. I hope if I'm audible to everyone. If there are issues, please put it on the chat screen. Uh, my kind of role here is to give you a. Since Indika did a very specific, more outright NVC focused conversation discussion. I am actually not going in the NYC direction, but I'm going to give you a sense of where um, the current media landscape, the so-called media landscape is. And actually more than discussing about media, because I think all of you probably are more qualified to talk about media than myself. So I will speak about the context in which we are dealing with these challenges, which are actually, in a way, contributing to violence, conflict, and how the media is right in center of it. Sometimes the media is accused of being part of it, or sometimes the media is a victim of it. So, in that context, I want to have a conversation with you about the very recent transformations in the landscape, because the landscape has gone through significant transformations. I will kind of do a little bit of history, maybe bring you up to speed if you have forgotten. Some of you, I mean, I checked your profile. Some of you may have good memories about the events I speak about. Some of you are quite young. So we have what we call a generational, challenges when we talk about media. And some of you are, when you say media, social media is the main thing. For some of us who have seen both the legacy and the so-called legacy media and the social media, I mean, we have different perspectives, right? Let me focus on that. So we'll go to the set of slides, and from the slides, I'll guide you. My interaction is a little bit more old school in the terms of interaction. So there will be more my things coming from my side, and but at the end of the lecture, we can have a conversation, right? So I wanted to talk about media literacy and contemporary challenges. So I'm not going to talk about media literacy per se, because I think all of you are journalists, because you are media literate. So I mean, there is no question there. But I probably want to focus on the contemporary challenges, right? So I thought start from a abstract issue, right, and then we'll go into something more concrete later on, right? So when we take on topics like anything, when it comes to social scientific inquiry, we always have to understand the time we are living in, right? Because all the conversations we have are intimately connected to the timeline, the times that we live in. So there is that particular understanding we have to take. So uh, and the timeline and the time context is changing very fast. So if I am to discuss about, when I say contemporary, in certain contexts, contemporary can be 21st century. In certain contexts, contemporary can be modern, which is like mid, 19th century onwards. But for me, when I say contemporary in the context of media, I think the last 5 to 6 years, and then probably the last 10 years, something like that. So what we are talking about, the context change rapidly, and we are talking about the context that I think is very important to today's conversation, which is actually the social, economic, political transformations that took place in the last 5 to 10 years, right? And this is very crucial, because if you look at the transitions, one of the major changes is how we access information, how information is directed to us, and how we process it. So the general ideas have been, there is what we call information overload, or some people call we are living in times of extreme, extreme vitality of information. There is so much of information. Information overload, or what we call the right term, if I put it in a more nicer term, is the abundance of information. But we are living in a poverty of analysis. Why? Because there is so much of abundance of information. The time to analyze and reflect is very low or very short. Now, as journalists, all of you know, right? Conventional journalism had what we call the 3-point verification, right? Some of you may know this. If you are a journalist, right? If you get a story, if you are to do a story, you have to do what we call the 3-point verification. Can anyone tell me what is the 3-point verification? If you, some of you are been in the field for some time, what does it mean? Have you heard of this point, the 3-point verification? Some of you who are social media journalists, yeah, yes, some of you have heard of. Yeah, so basically, the story has to be verified from at least 3 sources, right? Right, but what the last 5 to 10 years have done, especially with the rise of social media. When I say rise of social media, basically what we mean is the emergence of Web 2.0 platforms, right? Platforms, and then driven by a smart integrating with the internet, right? That's the whole point, right? That's the change, the type of change we are talking about, right? So that's roughly say 2005, 2006, 2007, because the first smartphone was unveiled in 2007. Of course, there is a debate around it. Apple argues it unveiled the first smartphone, the iPhone. What does it? What do you mean by smart versus a dumb phone? It's a fact that the phone was connected to the internet. That is the whole idea of a smartphone, right? Because of enabling technologies such as GPS technologies being incorporated into the phone, which was not there before, right? GPS was actually made for the armament industry. Then it became what we call transferred into the civilian sector, dual use technology. So when what we call the social media transition took place, it started challenging the role of what we call traditional journalism. Because normally when you are a journalist or when you process yourself media, right? I mean, media itself is a controversial term. There are different roots to the meaning, but the Latin root is media, means being in the middle. Yeah, that's what media means. That's the kind of, if you look at the etymology, there are of course other roots as well, but that is very telling of what you as a media person is, right? So you have to if you are transmitting, or if you are talking about, or if you are going to share a story, it has to be verified. But social media drastically undercut that ability to verify, because social media accelerated the urgency for the tool to come out, right? So for example, a lot of people don't remember this. Twitter, more than Facebook, became the frontline, citizen media, putting an average person becoming a journalist, that particular transition was done by Twitter, and Twitter achieved it thanks to one incident. I don't know if you remember, a few months after Twitter was launched, there was that specific landing of a passenger airline, which both engines malfunctioned due to landing into New York, and the aircraft landed on the Hudson River. One of the most miraculous escapes of any civilian, avoiding of any civilian air disasters. The captain and his co-pilot managed to land the aircraft on the river, and it didn't even sink, which saved lives of everyone. No casualties. And they call it the miracle of the Hudson. If you can't remember, you can just Google it. Miracle of the Hudson. And that was the first event that was Twitterized. Twitter became so popular because ordinary people who were walking past the Hudson River somehow started reporting the story, right? So suddenly people realized the power of Twitter was the ability to, simultaneously broadcast whatever you see. It was more powerful than Facebook. Of course, Facebook was also a powerful tool, but this short bursts of information, right? Uh, it became a very powerful tool. We'll discuss about that. In a way, this last 10 years, you see this kind of transitions taking place, which qualitatively changed the media landscape and the role of what we call a media personality. That went from and it had so many repercussions. There were positives, there were negatives. So it's a transitionary process. There, what we call the classic techno social science term is what we call a technological disruption. Technological disruption, right? Like Uber, Airbnb. These are what we call technology disruptions to processes that were very much entrenched, and suddenly they all changed. So that's a techno term. Of course, again, some people don't agree on that. So parallel to that, in the last 10 years, there were so many developments, but one major concerning development, if you see, because of information overload, the more you had social media, more you had smart devices, more you had information, images, stories, videos circulating in the sphere, media sphere. Actually, there are billions and billions of gigabytes of information flowing around, right? So it has made some people's lives impossible. Now, for example, I'm an academic, I'm a university lecturer, professor, whatever. So if somebody asks me, what is my job? What is my duty? I mean, I will, of course, say university professors, lecturers. When I say professor, not the professorial, but professor in the terms of the role. The role is very simple. You have to teach, impart knowledge, disseminate knowledge. You have to create knowledge, generate knowledge, that is research. And then you have to administer knowledge dissemination. That is, you have to administer your role as a university administrator. So a lecturer can be a head of a department, lecturer can be a dean, lecturer can be a vice chancellor. But the lecturer has, or a director, a lecturer can be a course coordinator. So that is the role. But the core is knowledge, right? So what's happening now, especially in the world, is that, and the knowledge is based on what we call certain foundational truths. So from a professional perspective, I can disseminate falsehood. As a university lecturer, I can't go to a class or do a lecture like this and tell false things. I can't. That goes against the central premise of my role as educator. But what has happened outside of my role is that so many people have taken the liberty to disseminate anything they want and they think is right. So this has led to, in the last 10 years, a huge, big debate among academics, among scholars, among policymakers. Because the people who are lying are not just people who are without power. More and more, what we are seeing is people with power. When I say power, it's not just politics, right? It can be influence, right? It can be the most powerful person in your family, the most prominent. It may be the most eldest person in your family. It can be the most, rich, the person who has abundance of wealth in your family. So It doesn't matter. But people with authority, it can be a religious leader. So what has happened is that the general argument, the general discussion is, we have moved into a times of what people call a very interesting term, post-truth. Post-truth. And in 2016, this particular term has entered the lexicon of the Oxford Dictionary and Oxford language, right? And actually, in 2016, it was the word of the year. Of course, 2016 was very interesting. 2016 was kind of a from a Western perspective, that was the year that President Donald Trump came into power. And then there was major debates across democratic societies that the rise of this new US presidency was based on a lot of falsehood. This was the same year the recently ousted, self-exiled, the leader of the Afghan national government, Ashraf Ghani, came to power. He fled maybe a week back out of Afghanistan. Right. So there are many things that happened in 2016, but it was this particular year that, 5 years back, we saw the term post-truth enter the lexicon. So if I move into the next slide, right, there were parallel terms that were kind of brought out with this kind of thing. And the other term that, this particular timeline we saw was what we call was because of post-truth, Paschat Satya. That means a society which has gone beyond the truth. So, which means post-truth means anything that may sound like the truth. May anybody believes could be the truth, had value, had currency. That is why, if you see in last 5-6 years, so much of hatred, conflict in society, especially not wars. So wars, for example, we had terrorism, we had extremism, we had, there were tensions between countries, Ukraine and Russia. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking something deeper, right? About how so there is this argument that the 21st century is not about countries or states. Those will always be there as long as the concept of the state is there. We are at a time when societies are at war against each other, or societies are crumbling. Why? Because societies were built on certain contracts, certain beliefs, certain acceptances, certain knowledge, certain norms. That is crumbling. 10 years ago in Sri Lanka, we would have never thought one race or what ethnicity will be targeted, saying, they sell things that will make you infertile or something like that. Get the point, right? So these are the times of post-truth. That is, we have gone beyond the truth, Paschat Satya. The problem is people believe it. And then, very interestingly, Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama, for some people, I think is a familiar name. I like him too, as he's one of the most prominent but controversial political scientists in the US and international relations philosopher and expert. He was the person who wrote at the end of the Cold War, End of History and The Last Man Standing, one of the most widely read and cited articles and books during the post-Cold War era, and that defined US foreign policy for decades. And he also himself went through a lot of transitions from being what we call a neoconservative to being a more of a pragmatist liberal at the moment. And he's a big name. So if you are interested, you all should do a little bit of search, and a lot of good interviews with him, Francis Fukuyama. And he wrote this very short article, and he gave a new terminology. He said we are in a post-factual society. So one of the most striking developments so again, he refers, I'm going to quote the slide. one of the most striking developments of 2016 was the emergence of the post-fact world, right, in which virtually all authoritative information sources are challenged by contrary facts of dubious quality and provenance. In a world without gatekeepers, there is no reason to think that good information will win out over bad. It's a very, if you're a journalist, this is your $1 million or million rupee, whatever problem, right? How, as a journalist, myself, uh, kind of communicate information analysis, provide perspective in societies which are very much, challenging established facts. If you remember, in Sri Lanka also there was this major discussion. Hardly Lord Buddha was born in Sri Lanka, and to date there are people who believe, and there was a big narrative around. Suddenly we had the re-emergence of the mythological stories of Ravana, right, and recreation of, suddenly we have bigger issues, but going behind stories like that. And those stories take a lot of currency and they are very powerful, right? And the problem is it's not in the peripheries. Now it's coming to the mainstream. ප්‍රධාන ධාරාවට එන අදහස. ප්‍රධාන ධාරාව පශ්චාත් සත්‍යයට ගියොත් මොකද වෙන්නේ? Because some of you are quite senior journalists, most of you are younger, emerging, and who are working. So how do you, because a journalist always have to have what I call a moral compass. Because journalists should understand you're not being a journalist for the sake of being a journalist, right? You can be, but you also have to understand you have a larger responsibility, because you are a gatekeeper to a certain extent. Journalists are gatekeepers, right? You don't let everything go out. But what social media, these technologies, these transformations, what I told you about, have done is destroyed or kind of overrun gatekeepers. Are finding it very hard these days. The seduction is gatekeepers also try to overrun the public. So that is why you have to sensationalize so many stories and add so many dimensions, right? So there is a big battle between legacy media trying to survive, and that survival is based on more and more sensationalizing. But the cost of that is the cost on society, right? Tensions, conflicts, violence, which is the core of non-violence communication. So non-violent communication is becoming harder and hard because of the time we live in. We can teach about the fundamentals, we can argue about it, debate about it, but that is why I said it's always good to have a consciousness of the time we are living in. That is why I'm bringing this post-factual and post-truth argument. Then a conscience to not to be swayed by that same tide. If you're swayed by the same tide, it's no point in being a journalist or trying to be someone. It's a very challenging time. It's very difficult. It's not going to be easy, right? But if you සවිඥානික වීම මේ අපි ඉන්න කාලේ ඒ තුල අපි කොහොමද මූණ දෙන්නේ? අපි කොහොමද අපේ රාජකාරී කාර්යභාරය කොහොමද? That's the important. How are we going to be conscious and then build a conscience? අවධානය විඥානය. Right? Then only you can have a moral. That is why I kind of took some time to discuss this idea of post-factual society, because a lot of people ask the question, why are you even doing these things? People will be asking you also, why? because we are not conscious about that this major transition that has happened. This transition has happened because of so many social, political, economic reasons. It may be because for political power. It may be because for economic power. It may be because for so many other reasons, right? But it has so many, it may be because there is this clash, right? But the whatever it is, the consequences is the violence, the conflict, right? Are we clear up to that point? Since I can't see any of you, and since I can't get any feedback, I just want to stop for, because I've been going on for nearly 30 minutes. But it's very important that we go into this kind of discussion. Can you, if there are, if you all can, if you want, any questions? Are we clear? At least some response I would appreciate. If there are observations you want to make, please do. So I'm trying to tie this up into a very interesting problem. This research problem is not my creation. This whole thing can be found on the University of Carleton's journalism website. But I thought it's a very good research problem for us to move on, as Sambhavi says, move on in our today's discussion, but with a kind of a more bringing it into today's context, right? And it reflects what I was just saying. Journalism as an industry and a profession was already experiencing a crisis. That particular crisis was partly driven by the fact that journalism as an industry was facing so much of challenges from economic downturn, techno journalism, because more and more artificial intelligence, more and more, because I told you, we are living in time of information abundance. The only possible way some kind of information analysis is done is through algorithms. There is a good to that, there's a bad. There are many many media organizations now are hiring less and less journalists, but they're investing more and more high-performing artificial intelligence algorithms, so that, for example, market analysis, business analysis. You can see in certain newspapers, you can see the analysis, but they're not written by any human journal. They're written by an AI. So that's because of the cost, right? And itself was experiencing a crisis because of the diffusion of information and the modes and who are giving information. Now, for example, if you now this is a very good example. I always bring this example sometimes. In Sri Lanka, if you look at the last few years, there were a lot of, say, controversial topics. Take the US Millennium Challenge Corporation grant. US, there was this idea of US SOFA, status of force agreement, then the Hambantota Chinese investment in Hambantota, right? Port city, right? Big controversial topics. And then take even KNDU bill, right? If you look at the biggest voices, the most journalistic analysis actually came from some very powerful, very few, YouTube, not all YouTubers, but there is this guy, I think the tuition master. This is not a personal thing, but very popular. He makes analysis, hundreds and thousands Sri Lankan followers, right? And he will analyze. So he will analyze COVID. He will analyze vaccines. He will tell you which vaccine is better. He will tell you why the Millennium Challenge Corporation is bad. Very influential. So what social media has done is create such alternative. It's not the class, neither the time to discuss the pros and cons, right? That was a very localized example, but interestingly, global examples also. There was a guy called Moses Alfred, I can't remember. He's the one who runs Bellingcat. Bellingcat is like an information service, but Bellingcat has been eternally fighting with it's like a website, web analysis with the Russian government. Russian government is facing the toughest challenge when it comes to the investigation on the downing of the Malaysian airlines over Ukraine. It's biggest challenge when you're looking at the international investigation and the court case that is going on comes from a website called Bellingcat, where Bellingcat argues that it's kind of using information imaginary triangulation of positions of various Ukrainian rebel movements and arguing that a particular anti-aircraft launcher was used to down the Ukrainian the Malaysian airlines, and that was actually that came from the Russia side, and very compelling. Again, it's run by one single person. Now he's I think he has enough funding. Of course, we can understand where that money is coming from, but he was just a guy who was sitting in a London flat and started analyzing information. He has never even been to Ukraine. He was things in Afghanistan. He has never seen Afghanistan, but all online information, and he has become a powerful source than any traditional legacy media. And his organization has enough information, evidence, he says, even to challenge the Russian government. So journalism as an industry and as a profession was in trouble, right? And COVID-19 actually plunged the whole global systems into crisis, right? And there's so much of mis and disinformation around COVID-19, and forcing even the WHO Director General to say that the larger problem is not the epidemic but the infodemic that we are dealing with COVID-19. But the interesting and the important thing for us is that still people turn to journalists, to media institutions for information, but people consume a lot of fake news, right? We all share stuff, efficacy of the vaccine, right? And all of these things, which vaccine is good. We have hardcore Marxists. I always laugh, sometimes joke. I have some people who are very anti-West, but don't want to take the Sinopharm. They want to get a Pfizer. So I said, oh, wow, there you are. That's the American in you speaking. So I mean, if you are pro Pfizer, don't be hurt. I'm just telling you, it's not. It's unconscious. It's not your fault. It's a colonial mind at work, because we think we have been decolonized. Of course, unfortunately, or fortunately. So this is a very interesting question, because we are living in a time of deep crisis, not just Sri Lanka, partly due to the effects of a relentless virus, which seems to be mutating, which seems to be not letting humanity develop sufficient herd immunity. So we are seeing a relapse even in the most vaccinated countries. One of the most vaccinated country is Israel, and now there is a relapse and there is an increase in cases, not deaths, but infections, right? So Israel, and then you see some of the most success stories coming from Belgium, and then of course Sri Lanka is in this relentless vaccine drive, right? So to make sense, and we are in a deep economic crisis, and so is the world. And India is in a deep economic crisis, right? So most of these questions people turn to journalists to answer, because the important thing is these crises are the main drivers of conflicts and tensions. Sometimes it is also a good thing. I'll come to that little later on. Shall we move on? I just want to give you the context so that the current times of COVID-19. So we move to the next slide. So why is then media literacy important in times of the post-truth? This is a little bit of theoretical analysis, right? Because media literacy effectively navigating the current information environment. As I said, the current information environment is highly loaded, overloaded to a certain extent, highly, it's so much of information. So it requires, so if you're a journalist in this particular time, you have to have a bigger, larger, wider skill set, as well as critical mind, right? Such as the ability to evaluate sources, understand the context of communications, and responsibility create and share information. Because the context can be very different, right? So now, for example, why are people so? Now, I'll take this example of Pfizer. Why people believe Pfizer is good? Why is Sinopharm bad? For example, what's the context there? If you break this down, you will see a massive geopolitical war of information dominance based on market interest, right? For the West, let's without mincing words say there is a major global tussle for global leadership between, say, China and the US. Both are doing everything to undermine each other. And there is so much of paid campaigns to discredit each other. Right. So it's very clear the vaccine, at a certain level, there is vaccine diplomacy. Vaccine as a means of statecraft, engaging, achieving your own interests. The other one is it's a vaccine war, right? War, and the war is against societal, not diplomatic. Neither it is military. It is a social, making people believe something is good and something is bad. Perception. That is the power of perception, right? That is power. I'll come to that discussion. That is theory. For most of you people who have done theories of power, this will be okay. But that's the conversation about power that we're going to have. Because media, because that is why there is conflict. Conflicts are there. Yeah? I think Indika also asked you this question at the beginning. You think conflict is good or bad? But the point is, conflict is inevitable because societies are driven, unfortunately, by forces of power. That's a very deterministic statement, but that is how it works. At every level, people, organizations, corporations seek some kind of power. Power to and power over. We'll discuss that a little bit, right? So the gap between the demands of our information environment and the skills of the average individual results in unfortunate consequences, such as susceptibility to misinformation and disinformation and bias. So our responsibility is highlighted here because average people, average person. This, when I say average, it's not like, it can be the most educated person. I get tons of fake news channel from some of the most educated and more qualified friends, who are, engineers, who are, who are management experts, who have PhDs, but still sometimes they send some fake stuff. You're compelled to believe. People believe in certain, stuff that we, find it very difficult even to fathom, right? Because there are so many narratives which are constructed. Even the most educated people sometimes miss it. That is why you, as journalists, we need to have that kind of contextual analysis. Where is this coming from? Can it be true? Where can I verify this? Whom can I reach out to? What are the facts? So, for example, where is the data? Right. There is this very interesting article actually coming from the Western Global Governance Institution. How why at a certain point people thought COVID-19 was a bioweapon. and then how people thought it was by political leaders of the West. If you can remember, the Trump administration in the US, they clearly started calling the COVID-19 virus as China virus. How they created a massive fear among people. And even in India, I can remember certain very strong anti-Chinese journalists saying the Chinese virus. And suddenly the China organization, it was called the China organization. So suddenly you saw that happen. And then these kinds of things can really lead to conflict, tensions, and also problems. Uh, because it was very difficult later to take that back, right? So if I'm going to read the last kind of section on this slide, media literacy can be thought of as an approach to processing information that can be applied in any context. At its core, media literacy refers to the abilities to access, analyze, evaluate, and communicate various media messages in a variety of forms. So it gives you the ability to communicate after understanding and analyze. That's the whole idea of behind the term media literacy, right? Okay, we'll take the next slide, please. Okay, so kind of put all of this into context, how all of these things happen. I'm my mainstream, my area is international relations, international security and technology. That's kind of how my worldview is shaped, that's my kind of academic world. uh, and I want to take global events and to show you how the media landscape changed. So you can see three images here, right? If you start from the top one, right, number two, and the last one is number three. Anybody recognizes these images? Of course, I think the second one, most of you will. What is the first one? The first image is from the first Gulf War, right? No, Saddam Hussein, then Iraqi president, invaded Kuwait, and a massive led by the US and NATO and many other friendly forces quickly bombed him out. No, Sachin. It's from the first Gulf War. So this is an image of this is an iconic image those days of Iraqi soldiers surrendering. So that was 1991. It was the first Gulf War, where there is a huge history and a context. I don't have the time, no, it's not the place to discuss it. But so it was probably for me, it was the beginning of the what is happening now in the Middle East and the Greater Middle East, Central Asia, in Afghanistan, whatever, probably relates back to this particular event, conflict. So I have taken three different types of conflicts. 1991, exactly, we are said, I mean, it's the anniversary of the 30 years anniversary since the first Gulf War, 20 years since the 9/11 attacks, and 10 years since Arab Spring, right? The third image is from Arab Spring, as I think Samba, we got it right. But the location, this is the most icon. I mean, the Arab Spring happened took place in various ways, in various levels, and to a certain extent, various. No, Kirtika, it's an image of protesters converging in the iconic Tahrir Square in Cairo, and they were living there as to get Mubarak out. It was another most iconic protest in the 21st century, right? And of course, 10 years on, the results are, there's a big debate about whether it went right. It was the key center focus of the Arab Spring. right? So 1991, 30 years ago, 2001, 20 years ago, 2011, 10 years ago. All these have serious relationship with the media, right? And how all these things are happening now. That's why I brought it up. We'll go to the next slide. Things will become clearer. Yeah. So 30 years back, most of you won't remember. Some of you will, right? Uh, the first Gulf War, if you don't know, as journalists, young journalists, it's what we call the first cable news war. It was covered. If there was no first Gulf War, CNN would have been not so big. Even now, for younger generations, for you guys, CNN is not that big, right? CNN has become quite weak. But in 1991, that was the first war that was brought to the doorstep to everybody's homes via what we call cable TV. A very new phenomenon. When we were growing up, that was like, wow, because it was probably the first live telecast war in modern history, right? So it was a conflict it's a conflict, but the media was used to kind of communicate, give an image of it, especially shaped by Western interests, by the Americans, to show how it was a very justifiable war. And it was also a beginning of the sanitization of warfare to a certain extent. Because the images they used, they were all images of mostly of cruise missile attacks on Iraqi targets, as well as bombing drops, night raids done by US Air Force, right? Of course, there was a logic why the Americans did this campaign. It's not, if you're learning international relations, that can be taught separately, but not today, not in this class. So it was basically what we call showcasing. So media was used to showcase power, right? So this later was, there were many books, analysis. This was called the CNN effect. Americans managed to showcase power. If you're not getting this is 1991, a few months after the end of the Cold War. The Cold War ended with the Soviet Union just collapsing, and Americans were very disappointed. It ended without them being able to showcase their power. So this was a major driver of the Gulf War. We can discuss that separately. But the CNN provided the means for America to showcase to the world how much of powerful they have got over the years of the Cold. So it was a way of showing, right? 10 years after that, you had the 9/11 attack. So I kind of say it's a very interesting logic behind it. How a non-state group understood the workings of this new media environment and carried out an attack on the most powerful nation on earth at that point. 2001, that was the pinnacle of American power. 10 years after the collapse of Soviet Union, and the US Americans were thinking they could do anything in the world and no resistance, no challenge, right? And we were the 9/11 attacks. How did the attacks unfold? Right? The iconic target was the Twin Towers, and the southern towers of the World Trade Center, WTC, downtown New York, right? If I remember right, I think the first aircraft hit the southern tower at 8:45. Maybe you can verify the accuracy of the timing. But if I remember, it's 8:45 in the morning of September 11, southern tower. The second aircraft didn't come immediately. Why? Why? What was the logic? Any reason? Some of you even might not remember 9/11 so well. You would have been so young still, again, 20 years back, right? Any reason you guys think? The reason was the attack was planned in such a way they gave 15 to 18 minutes. They were given 15 minutes for the second aircraft pilots to wait. Why? When the first aircraft hit, they knew every cable channel which was based in New York and head office and would come there. And the attack will be live telecast to a global public. The Americans established themselves by telecasting their superiority to the world. The Al Qaeda announced how they could challenge the US by using the same journalistic, the way the logic of cable media function. All of you know, as journalists, what is your success? I mean, commercial success. The why is how many ears or eyes you grab, heads, or what you call eyeball, ratings, numbers. So they knew exactly every cable channel wanted to capture it. So that particular competition, right? That particular competition was understood very well by Al Qaeda. So the second attack happened 18 minutes after the first one. The second aircraft flew into the northern tower after 18 minutes. So that everybody on Earth was watching. Most people were convinced. So if many people didn't see the first one hitting the towers, but the second tower being hit, billions of people. So that was a way of challenging power, right? And 10 years on, social Arab Spring, the image I showed you, was at the point of the emergence of social media and the idea of citizens, people, and that was a very different logic. And and this Arab Spring was kind of used in a way by protesters and everybody to undermine state power by creating narratives neither the state no the what do you call cable, more established media could kind of work around. So Arab Spring actually challenged the basic logic of power. Of course, it challenged state power. Also, it challenged mainstream media, because when mainstream media was reporting, most of these protesters had finished, have reported the things, and people were consuming information on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. Right. Arab Spring started right in Tunisia. If you remember the protests, I mean, the protests were going on. Yes, citizen journalists, but citizen journalism also has challenges. When you start saying citizen journalism, what are the limits? What are your responsibilities? What is your worldview? Are you doing the right thing? Right. So yeah, you're right, Sambal. But it also it challenged the normal paradigm of how mainstream media function, the ethics, the verifications, the editing, which terms to use, sanitization. How do you because all of these are conflict related. What I'm trying to show you is how media and conflict are related, and how each drives and each kind of sometimes creates the other, right? So even citizen journalism, though it's a positive thing, it kind of created a lot of violence. And citizen journalism didn't start at this point. I will take you back to a certain different point. Uh, I'm not too sure in media classes what you're taught, but from international relations, political science analysis, I'll show you some certain start points, but definitely not Arab Spring. But Arab Spring was where the Web 2.0 revolution, the social media revolution, was used heavily by citizen journalism to really challenge stories that came from mainstream media. That is why I don't know that you people notice this, but after Arab Spring, most news media channels, actually Arab Spring also was the death, was the rise of Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera was the success story in Arab Spring, and also the rise of Al Arabiya, right? So because these two media stations were far ahead than traditional CNN or Deutsche Welle or Channel 24 in France. They all kind of and soon, why were they successful? They quickly adapted, and most mainstream media now has social media components. You have citizen journalists, you have social media analysis, you have them embedded. You have, that is why these alerts, news alerting systems, the social media arms of mainstream media started becoming more important. Now, even in Sri Lanka, every mainstream media has its social media. Probably one of the drivers of that change of philosophy was because of nine Arabs. And you can see how power conflict is related, right? Are we clear up to that point?
Yes, sir.
Any clarifications? Any so because these are things that you do, because I'm trying to make connections, because for you it's as a young journalist, it's always good to have that connectivity in your mind, in an intellectual way, academic way, as well as a policy, how things change in the world, and a little bit of history also. Right. I'll leave time for Q&A at the end, where I'm just doing a bit of a conventional style lecture, but I think some of these points has to be first said rather than being asked from you. That's why I thought I'll go on. So okay, we'll move to the next slide. So this, the crux of my presentation has these 2 points, which is also related to conflict and violence, right? Information, we are looking at power of information versus the information power. Power of information has always been, earlier, most of the time, driving traditional journalists. You provide information that can challenge any source of established authority or any source of lie. Because the premise here is even established authorities can lie. Now, for example, the argument is a government can falsify information for, say, maybe intentionally provide stability, or unintentionally because they wanted to. States, governments don't like to lose legitimacy. There are 2 classic examples. One was how the US government was trying to suppress the My Lai massacre during Vietnam War, and then recently in Afghanistan in, I think, 2011 or something, I can't remember. There was a very famous, well-known attack called the Kunduz in the province of Kunduz. The Kunduz, the city was, the hospital was attacked by American C-130 gunship. C-130 gunships are very, very, very bad news for people. I mean, they say it's basically a flying tank. The C-130 cargo aircraft converted into a massive, fire. It has so many different types of weapons that can be fired simultaneously to the ground. A C-130 decimated a hospital, and the Americans put a news out saying we took out Al Qaeda target. And then suddenly, what they didn't really know was that it was a hospital that was manned by Médecins Sans Frontières doctors, MSF doctors. And within 2 minutes, within a minute of the attack, they were tweeting. And the tweeting, putting images out saying, look, people are dying, our staff hit, and the Americans have hit a hospital. And suddenly the whole narrative changed. And the US had to do investigation, they had to apologize. So that's power of information. And in certain times, in our societies also, we have seen how media stations try to provide information in investigative reports. You see it in mainstream media channels, and you also see it in alternative media, YouTubing, stuff like that. It's information. The other thing is the more worrying one, is information power. Who has the power of information? This is where journalists have to be very careful. Source of power of information. I told you about the example between Pfizer and Sinopharm. Examples of of which test to take. Which company is more is better, right? This creating and convincing people, that is informational power. If you want to be a powerful nation, what countries have always done is to provide the image of their authenticity and for example, popular culture, the Hollywood, they gave a sense of what the West was about. And now you see China also doing superb campaign portray the Chinese version of society, culture, truth, democracy, rights, diversity. Because in international relations, we call this part of soft power. And I remember very vividly, there was Shashi Tharoor, the Indian politician and diplomat, who's not a great politician, but who's a great speaker, who's a very respected intellectual. Once said, soft power is not about whose army that will win, but whose story that will win. Your stories are very powerful. So images of, so we call this nation banding also. Countries have their stories, right? And you see it, India is trying to say incredible India, right? Right. So we are also in Sri Lanka, we are trying to talk about our hospitality and all these things. But that is the informational power. Informational power can be with people, it can be with politicians, right? Sometimes I'll show you this information, how things have changed, and sometimes the most, the biggest lie still can be sold to the people because of information power. You may have the power to sell the lie because you have the power of information. There are a lot of cases against Facebook, against Twitter, against social media platforms saying, they are supporting sometimes, spreading of lies, spreading of, we'll come to that, right? But this is the kind of crux of the conversation, because both either can be drivers of conflict or can be leading to violent communication. But if handled, can be sources of good non-violent communication, right? To calm things down. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. Yeah. Here, I gave you, I mean, some of you might be bored with what I said earlier about Iraq war, 20 years since the 9/11. But I'll bring things out to something to the ground, right? Especially most of your young journalists, social media platforms are used. Actually, social media, journalism, activism, they all came together around few events, right? Towards the end of 20th century, globally, there were dissatisfaction among different communities of people, mainly farmers, right? Farmers in US, farmers in India, farmers in in Mexico. There were a lot of problems because the farmers felt their produce was getting a very bad deal because of major trade deals done at WTO, World Trade Organization, right? So in 2000, just as the dawn of the new century, based from the US, so it's not American. It was the US started seeing, especially state of Washington, was the site of the next World Trade Organization meeting. Suddenly, something very, very kind of peculiar happened. Something that they had not seen before. Suddenly, people started taking flights to the US or from all over the world and started converging in Seattle, right? And this was it started suddenly massive protest, and even in the US, a lot of people started traveling across using trains and all this converging here. This was called the anti-globalization movement, right? And if you guys can Google this up, you will see a lot of this particular image on the slide on the right bottom right. That's an image of that. So these were farmers, activists, students, gay, lesbian rights, activists, so many different types of activists converging, right? And actually they were having it was not by falsehood. Their argument, there was sense, there was information, fact. They were saying they were getting a bad deal because World Trade Organization was, it was doing something really odd. But this was the first, what we call internet driven campaign. But this was much before Facebook or everything. This was 2000. Internet was just 4 5 years old. But most of this was done through what we call bull. So this is where I think most of the citizen modern age started, right? It started parallelly a little bit before that. If you look at the slide, the top one on the left corner, that is a graffiti. I think it's not very clear to you. It's called indiemedia.org. Indie was a collective of activists globally. Indie is still there, but I think it's a bit different now. India Media Network started. It was called Indie that's why it's an independent media. All ground-based activists, mostly left-wing, mostly anti-capitalist. Seeing a lot of injustice because of big corporations, big pharmaceuticals, big agriculture companies, big governments and companies coming together, a lot of corruption. This was their kind of mantra. They started setting up online networks, bulletin boards. They had their own websites, and these anti-globalization protesters started linking up. This was all done through bulletin boards, which is very difficult. Not like Facebook or anything. It's still very static one-way communication. But this was the time of the what we call the glorious days of email mobilization. There were massive email lists. These are all emails that were actually connecting these people. On email, they were being told to go here and there, and of course, SMS based. There was the biggest SMS based protest took place not in this part of the world but in Philippines. They say that was the more anti. There was against one of the very corrupt presidents, Joseph Estrada. It's called the anti-Estrada movement. If you can, that was where SMSs, texting was used to organize protests, right? But these protests were not based on lies. They were based on actual grievances. This is where some kind of origins of birth of citizen media you can see. Indiemedia.org is a very good, interesting area for you to do research. And most of them were non-violent. Anti-globalization rallies in Seattle turned violent because of only one group. There was a German-based radical group of what we called extremists who were radical left, what we call radical, animal rights activists. They were the ones who started breaking. They were down doors and windows of banks and McDonald's and all these things. There was violence, but limited. But only one group. But most of the other groups which were protesting were non-violent. They weren't exact. There were good examples of non-violent communication as a way of protesting. Even the New York police were kind of told, look, don't confront. Of there were events of confrontations because of the black bloc. Black bloc was the more violent aspect of that. But that was the beginning, using internet, social media, not social media, internet. This was internet based, no social media, right? But then the more social media driven events took place 10 years later on, right? Two major movements are examples I can bring. Parallel to the Arab Spring, in Western countries, there was a movement called the Occupy movement that was coming. Again, anti, and you can see on the right, top right, that is some people love this guy, Slavoj Žižek, famous Slovenian philosopher. Žižek was in downtown Washington. He was doing a book launch, but he came and spoke with the protesters. That is Occupy Wall Street movement. Downtown New York. And then parallel to that, little later on came the Black Lives Matter movements. Most of you are familiar with both of these. These movements created a lot of copycats globally. Globally in Thailand, in India, Malaysia, there were movements which were inspired by this. But slowly, you can see this is social media based. The narrative was shifting. People who were seeking justice, there was a lot of lies being translated as, right? And the high point of it was that last picture, the bottom picture on your left corner. People, do you recognize that picture? Anybody recognizes that picture? The guy with that American flag with the horns.
So is it when the white extremists went to the White House because of Trump's defeat?
Not the White House, but they invaded. They kind of went to the Congress building. Yes. So that yes, white supremacist groups, not just white, they're called mostly driven by the QAnons, the Qs. If you just do a search, even a homework, not for me, but for yourself, look at the study of the rise of the QAnon movement. A movement totally based on falsehood, but a movement which so many Americans are now, who are educated Americans also, are now part. This movement could use social media to mobilize thousands of protesters to storm the Congress building. Storm the Capitol, the heart of American democracy, and put it to stop. And some people had to die, and they actually managed to come in, right? They managed to actually occupy. They were on the premise of lies. The premise that the election was sold, the premise that minorities were influencing, the conspiracy of other countries invading America. The QAnon movement is so powerful today, and there's a worry that in the next election, US election, right, that there will be a return of a leadership that is purely based on falsehood, because people are consuming this information thanks to the information, corrupted information ecosystem in that country. So you can see how even well-intended citizen journalism, well-intended stuff has led to this moment, and also more and more violence is involved. So we're talking about non-violent communication at a time of this crisis. Are we clear there?
Yes, sir.
Any questions, any observations? I think we can resume. Shall we go to the next slide, Bundu?
Sure, sir.
Yeah. So I wanted to bring this out in parallel to what I was showing you, right? So one of the major challenges in communication, as well as in the context of nonviolent communication, is that social media, because all of us are very social media savvy, all of you, most of the reporting is through social media. Is a problem is because it's intrinsically linked to how social media has driven behavioral changes, right? So with social media, we see what I mean, even prior to social media, we see this concept of social engineering, right? The fact that how we can change behavior of people. That is also part of the whole power conversation. Even I think if you guys remember the George Orwell's novel 1984, there is a particular line which says power is in tearing human minds to pieces and putting them back into the shape that you choose. Orwell argues that it's about how you. So social media has made that easy, right? Because here you heard of this, but the engineers behind social media had specifically designed their platforms to be addictive, right? Because every time we get a like, every time we get a comment, our mind fires up, and what we call, they say, tiny bursts of dopamine as a goes on. So we then kind of get this addicted to this cycle. So you want to put something out that will get more likes. You're not going to put something which is going to create a lot of dislikes or a lot of so you're driven by that kind of you're entrapped in that. So even when you're doing stories and stuff, you might want to write, or you might you kind of electing doing what people will like to hear. That's very much linked to this notion of post-truth, right? Because the popular ideas, the popular thinking, but we very well should know that's the challenge as journalists we should take up. The most popular thing is never the right thing, right? I mean, that is the whole premise of states, premise of philosophy, of statehood, of politics and governance. But social media has trapped so many people in that particular logic, right? And certain social media ventures have gone into serious violation. In the case of Cambridge Analytica, right? How provide data to make behavioral changes in the context of politics. So you will know at times of elections or anything, you can see how the social media is being used to manipulate behavior. So these are some of these biggest challenges. And I took this particular bit out from a book. The reference is given below. It's a very interesting book by Peter Pomerantsev. It's called "This Is Not Propaganda: Adventures in the War Against Reality." I mean, if you have time, money, I would recommend to read that book. Very interesting. But again, anything read on these lines have been carefully taken. There is this big Western bias about certain things. So there is a lot of media reports and analysis coming targeting against Russia and China. I'm not trying to say Russia and China are innocent, but more the stuff we read about West projects them entirely as perpetrators. But I think the West also is very much responsible to fake news, disinformation, and propaganda. Actually, it is old school propaganda that is now emerging as strategic communication because of the strategic importance of it. Okay, we'll go to the next slide, Paul. I want you to kind of I talked about the Arab Spring, but there is this particular I want to bring into how dangerous this disinformation can be and how fast it can be spread because of platforms. Of course, on the right side, you see the guy, the fruit vendor, Mohammed Bouazizi, who set himself on fire as protest against the local government authority because his gas propane can was taken away from his food cart and they were not returning, and he didn't have a way of to, he felt so desperate and he couldn't feed his family, his mother, his sister, looking after elderly mother and sister, and he felt so desperate and he doused himself with benzene and put himself up in front of the provincial government building, like and him burning his that was live kind of put on YouTube, and that actually was the one that triggered some of the protests, most of the protests in Tunisia. But I'm not referring to that. I'm referring to a different context. I'm referring to the video on the left. Some of I think we have some Muslim friends, journalists who are joining Sri Lankan joining this. I don't know that you have seen this, but this a trigger point because Arab Spring did good things, and also Arab Spring also created a lot of Islamophobia globally later on. Most of the Islamophobia that we are seeing now probably is a result of the events of Arab Spring, especially the mass scale migrations when countries like Egypt fell, that triggered a lot of anti-Islamic perceptions, mainly in Europe and then later on the rest of the world. And even in Sri Lanka, which we never had, suddenly we have some of the last years, and I think to a certain extent the COVID-19 actually doused that off. But this is a very tangible, very concerning example. I don't know how many of you have seen this. There was a movie which came out in Los Angeles. If you know about the movie industry in Hollywood and all, what we see is that A grade movies. There are so many B to C grade movies, small theaters where young and emerging directors dabble with so many different topics. And there was this, guy, a couple of directors who were not recognized. They did this movie called The Innocence of Muslims. Of course, it was very blasphemous, but in the context of US, the liberal thinking, it was fine by them. And it was never intended to for a large audience. They were trying to, maybe, but they were of course racist. They were anti-Islamic. But the problem was somebody uploaded this video to YouTube, and it telecasted across especially the Muslim world, and especially when it comes to the Arab world, it created so much of repercussions, so many protests, and the movie was seen as, so it was totally all the sides it was misinterpreted. The people who made the movie made it on a false premise about Prophet Muhammad. So it was lies there. And then the people who protested kind of went on the premise, this is the way generally American thinking of Muslims and American administration's standpoint on Muslims. The protests were so harsh, especially in one protest that happened in the Libyan city of Benghazi. Unfortunately, turned into a conflict, to a firefight, ultimately into the death of the US ambassador in Libya. And the consequence of that particular event, of the American ambassador dying in Libya, actually was a major point that led to the rise of the Republican anti-security establishment thinking, and to a certain extent, the rise of Donald Trump, and to a certain defeat of Hillary Clinton, because Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State at that time. And there was a blame on her for not taking action, sufficient action enough to save the ambassador, and also failures of the CIA. I think there are a couple of movies, even in Sri Lanka, it was shown, some movies were shown. There was the American Sniper, that was a movie that was made by the Republican Party to support Donald Trump. And there's another movie, The Last Hours or some 48 Hours or something, which was an action movie, but which depicted, this was the movie based on this death of the ambassador. But it showed how bad not just the US American government was, but US armed forces, the security establishment was, especially undermining the CIA. And it put private military contractors as the saviors, which was very much a logic that was present in the Trump administration. I mean, that's a different conversation, but these are all things that you should be very, contextual reading of things. But my point is how a C-grade production created a diplomatic crisis at that particular point, and later how it has a major impact on the US presidential campaign, which was one of the major reasons why Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in that particular election year, right? So the impact of social media, I mean, and we may think it's a very small regional, but how that can be picked up, and because of we are living in 2016 again, post-factual, post-truth society, how they can be powerfully recreated to undermine the truth and to sway public opinion, and to make people do things their way. So this is why I think in the context of nonviolent communication, this is why our conversation today is very important, because media literacy is one important way you can circumvent. You can prevent journalists also slipping and into these kind of situations. Right. Can we move on? So this is what we call polluted information ecosystem. So I don't want to read all of these things. These are the stuff that I have put for you to read. There are some readings I have given to be done. And these are, even if you are a Sinhala or Tamil stream journalist, it doesn't matter. Some of these reading is not very heavy, but it's a very important thing, because if the information ecosystem is polluted, you also are victim of it, right? So these are reading slides. I will move with this. Pumudu, can we keep moving? Next slide. So no, Pumudu, go back. That I want to highlight a little bit. So the impact is, what has happened now is that social media amplifies what we call fringe viewpoints. Right? Fringe viewpoints are the most non-relevant viewpoint. They are among the very minority. But social media has managed to bring those kinds of fringe viewpoints. Parivar adhas. They have been brought into the mainstream, right? And they have become part of mass propaganda. So in Sri Lanka, it was very clear, especially during that very sad period of time where we had a lot of Sinhala Muslim tensions among ethnic groups, particularly where based on the density of the Muslim population, and of course from both sides. Incidents in Mavanalla, where the Buddhist statues were attacked, and then incidents in Alutgama, and incidents where Muslim properties were attacked, Muslim, they're all based on certain misunderstanding, and some of it was very maliciously driven, right? Daludgam attacks, sorry, the Mavanal attacks on the Buddhist statues were never investigated, and same people later on were perpetrators of the Easter Sunday attack. The same groups were linked. And then also on the other side, how Sinhala extremist groups were accommodated to attack ordinary Muslim communities which were living in harmony. That was also, so you can see how the fringe voices on either side could have a major devastating effect. Mostly, if you remember, WhatsApp was used the same way the Hindu extremist groups use WhatsApp to mobilize to attack Muslim neighbors. Groups also, extremist groups, and that is why even in the presidential commission report after coming, which went to the president on Easter Sunday attacks, clearly said we have to take action against this, and also to understand the use of this kind of extremist voices on social media, very destabilizing for countries, and won't help at all for any form of non-violent communication. Right, moving on. So what has happened in the recent past is a general concern coming from all over society, all over the world, about how information is becoming weaponized. Facts are how lies are becoming weaponized, right? So in certain contexts, it's called truth decay. In certain contexts, it's called disinformation. In certain contexts, it's called weaponized narratives. Narratives are weaponized. That we believe the idea of a Vanda infertility, kind of a drug, that things like that, really dangerous, very powerful, and the falsification of facts. So these are the things that we have to be very, very careful about. So what I'm going to do is the rest of I'm going to I want to leave some time for a little bit of a Q&A. I think move on. I want to go to the last slide. The rest of it you all can read. Let's go to the last slide, Mundu. I'm explaining all these things. These are all for you to read. Here, we'll stop here, Mundu. Let's go back a little bit. Now I have put for you to read and for you to get a sense that because disinformation has become such a problem for countries, societies, countries have started now bringing regulations against disinformation. I heard a few questions were raised from Indica about legal, how the legal frameworks for non-violent communication, while Indica was right that there is a very big gray area countries are trying to address. Now I have brought you the Singapore, Malaysia, and Cambodia. Go forward, Podu. This is for you to read and to get some sense as well. It's a very dangerous path. For example, France probably was the first country in Europe to pass a law that clearly defines fake news, but it's controversial. Very difficult because it's filled with ambiguity. Whether it's fake or not, bordering on truth, bordering on. So when you put a legal framework, it's very challenging. But go forward, Pumudu, I want to show in these slides. Move forward. Yeah, in this slide, you can see in this. Oh, go back. This is an example from Sweden, Cambodia. So Sweden has set up a new authority to take on disinformation. But look at the right side of it. Government of Canada. You guys can go into this link to this site, right? They have kind of created what we call the Digital Citizens Initiative. For citizen journalists who are taking part today, you guys should explore this. It's about a policy shift in the Canadian government. Canada is a very multicultural, very diverse society. So they know one of the biggest problems Canada will face, especially they're very worried about the situation in the US. The supremacist groups, the radical left the radical right, the supremacists. There is a big problem in the US, right? So they are trying to create citizens initiatives to government supported to movements to kind of deal with fake news information and government supported it. I think there are a lot of information you can find there, and kind of even educate yourself and also to have a conversation. And this is important for the NVC program in general. Most of this information, Pomudu, I think I have shared with you all. The head of department and all your department will also benefit from these. How policies have shifted. So this is something we can have a conversation after the class. Something that I think is very important to look at how governments. So this is a range of ways governments are trying to deal with disinformation, because the worry is conflict, tensions, violence. How Sweden is doing it, how Singapore is doing it, how Cambodia, some countries are taking extreme measures, which I think are not the most right, it will lead to further problems. Canada is taking a very liberal, constructive, I think it's kind of constructivist approach. If you're looking at from a theoretical perspective, that Canada is taking. So these are things I think are very, very important that you guys can kind of, take stock of. But I want to let's move on to this also we can skip. Let's go to the last slide. Last slide is not the most ethically correct one. This was a slide I used a couple of years back in one lecture I did on disinformation at Columbia University. So because among universities, they say there are certain things that you can go to big major extremes. But I took this idea, this line from a very, I'm not a big literary person, but one of the few. I mean, I read. I used to read. Now, given the things we had to read for our academic work, our literary time is kind of is being compromised. But Gabriel Garcia Marquez is a all-time favorite of mine as an author. He's a radical thinker. He's superb. He's to read. He's one of the good things about Colombia. The moment you talk about Colombia, he's Colombian. The moment you talk about Colombia, there are a lot of negativities. Nation branding is gone really off. But this is a gem of a Colombian. He's a Pulitzer, I think Nobel Prize as well. As a literary. His line, this particular line should be in everybody's head, as journalists, as students, right? Why a post-truth society is so dangerous for all of us, especially academics and students who believe in education. All of you believe in knowledge. Either you are journalists or not, right? Because he says a lie is more comfortable than a doubt, more useful than love, and more lasting than the truth. If you enter a post-truth society, the durability of a lie, unfortunately, is much longer than a truth, right? It's like if you're broken-hearted by something, even a lie, you know how hard it is for you to come to terms with that. So as journalists, you have all the responsibilities of making sure you don't fall into this particular trap, being seduced into believing and disseminating half-truths. It will have far-reaching damages, and there is no way non-violent communication is possible if you get into this. So I hope that you will not, and you will have the contextual and critical vision to go through. I hope this lecture was useful. This lecture was it was not something direct. The lecture was only to give you a perspective. I always believe it is up to you to choose and to go into. I opened so many little windows for you to look into. And of course, there were concrete ideas about what's really wrong with society these days. What are the main challenges when it comes to power, information, and media? Gain something? I think it's a good time to stop. So you have about 5-10 minutes to have questions. If not, we can wrap up. The more we go into the lunchtime, more we lose our rationality to, power to rationalize. The hunger takes over. So that's the sad, that's the pride of the problem with our own makeup, right? So I hope I should thank organizers for getting me back for another round. So Pondu, thank you. I think I should thank Nuan Herat, the head of department, and who's a driving force in this, and of course his uh, who's our other friend. I lost the name. Nuan. He will be very angry with me. Your compatriot,
Hemant.
Dr. Hemant. I hope he's not listening. He'll be very angry with me. So two of you have brought me back, and thank you so much. And it was always a pleasure to be part of this whole endeavor, and I hope I did justice to your call. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, sir.
Any questions? Sorry, I should. If there are any questions, observations, time to ask. Well, if it was clear, well, that's my pleasure, as always.
So I have a question. I
Yeah,
do not
please.
know if it's like a proper question to be asking, but something I've noticed in the past few months or so is that I think some of the social media platforms also cover this fact that the news channels opt out certain news. And not only that, even the same news channel, when they present their news in the 3 languages, they opt out certain news items from the news in depending on which language they present it by. So isn't that like, though it's like not necessarily it's somewhat a hiding of the truth, because like they're actually opting out to say something that's happening within the country.
No, I totally agree with you. I think this is the actual logic of having this workshop. Is, I mean, of course, some of you are bound by the media institution that you work for, but as journalists in general, say social media and all, I think that is why there is that space for social media and citizen journalism, because media corporations always function under a certain logic. That logic, of course, media corporations are private entities. They have certain logic of existence, logic of of financial existence, the logic of political existence. So that is the case not just in Sri Lanka. If you look at, say, I mean, we are critical of Sri Lankan media, but if you look at just how CNN and Fox News, we juxtapose those two. Sometimes it's sad to see where the US has gone as a democracy. But if you look at other news stations, if you look at, take Press TV, which Iran was running, right? Of course, RT, the Russian television used to be, but now I think Russia is embroiled in a geopolitical tension, so there are also a lot of opt-outs. But I feel this is where I sometimes think the role of a social media journalist has is important. And because, as you say, there is intentional exclusions, which is inevitable because of model. That is something you have to understand. Media institutions are based on a certain logic of existence. They are, at the end, they are profit-making enterprises, right? When you took old school ones like Reuters and them, that was a little bit different. But most of the new entities are very much driven by the logic of that. So exclusions are inevitable because of the so many biases and loyalties that they have to maintain. So I think that is why that's responsible citizen journalists and young social media journalists. I don't think I agree it's not the right thing, but I think it's inevitable because it's a logic of existence. We, of course, you all cannot be oblivious to the fact that we are living in a capitalist society. So that is driving so at the end it's business. That is why I always tell you the best example was after 9/11. Can you remember after 9/11, 1 month into 9/11, Osama bin Laden came out of hiding and did a press conference, right? And then and then what happened to that? He was just using a camera in a cave, put it to the internet. What happened? Al Jazeera telecasted it. He justified the 9/11. What happened in the US? CNN went to town by telecasting it because they were worried Al Jazeera was eating into their market. But only after a few days, the Pentagon said, "Look, are you crazy? You guys, because of your hunger for profit, you're actually promoting him." And then quickly George W. Bush Jr. did a press, similar press thing, and had half the effect because nobody was interested in listening to him. And the market logic trounced the American national security state. That's one of the best examples for your question, because media institutions are fireballs. So that is why I think as individual journalists, you have a bigger responsibility. So that's my not very kind of sad answer to your very pertinent question, but I had to tell you the truth as well.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
But the issue is, sir, now that certain NGOs and certain Instagram pages that cover certain news and for example, politics.lk, they like, and Verite, they actually compare these, and actually this creates issues between.
I think that is the problem. That is the problem, because now what has happened is even the social media platforms are now kind of responded to that without creating. This is the difference between indie media and the current things. Indie media was never, so what is happening now is you take those snapshots, snippets taken from mainstream media without investigating. That is where that verification should come first. I mean, even institutions which are now saying they are verifying are not verifying properly. That's a bit of a sad thing. So that is why institutions like us, KDU, are doing our part, trying to highlight that. So I think we are happy if you can take that across. Thank you.
Right. So